Alright, so we're starting now with our second section on the phylum Chordata, and we've already made our way through the two subphyla of Urochordata and Cephalochordata, and now for the rest of the chapter we'll be dealing with the third subphylum, which is the Vertebrata. So, getting into the basics of the vertebrates, there are some traits that are exclusive to the vertebrates that we don't see in either of the other two subphyla. Obviously, vertebral column, the name vertebrata is indicative of the fact that this group is going to have a vertebral column, whereas the invertebrate groups, the tunicates and lancelets, don't have that. The vertebrates have a vertebral column, or spine, or spinal column, or vertebrae, but not spinal cord. Remember, that's something different. Spinal cord is nervous tissue. The vertebral column is going to protect the spinal cord from damage. We also tend to see a bit more in the way of cephalization in the vertebrates, so a much more well-distinguished head, lots of sensory organs, so a pair of eyes, pair of ears, well-developed nose in most cases. Again, things we didn't really see in the tunicates or the lancelets. We also see a cranium, because the vertebrates, more than almost any other group, are going to really have that centralized nervous system, and that's great, but the downside or drawback or disadvantage to a centralized nervous system is that if it's damaged, the animal is going to be in really bad shape. So having some protection around that brain is going to be absolutely critical to ensure that the brain is protected. The neural crest is a developmental process, or stage, I guess rather, where we see the beginnings of the brain and spinal cord, the central nervous system in general. So embryologically speaking, the neural crest is something we see in the vertebrates that we don't see in any other group. There are some unique internal organs that we'll look at a bit later in the course. So if you sort of think about it, we really haven't seen things like, a liver or a pancreas or a spleen or kidneys, different types of large versus small intestine. Stomachs, we really haven't seen much of that either. So a lot more in the way of specialized internal organs in the vertebrates as well. And we have an endoskeleton. And so the only other group we've seen that had that was the echinoderm group, but of course the vertebrate endoskeleton is going to be very different as far as composition, and also how it's laid out inside the body. All right, so a little bit of a history here of the vertebrates. We are not going to go into a whole lot of detail in this historical stuff as we go through the vertebrates, but the group has been around for as long as just about every other group of animals, around 545 million years, give or take. So, we talked about the Cambrian explosion back in our first chapter. The vertebrates have been around since around that same time. The earliest vertebrates, not surprisingly, not very complex. Basically a mouth at one end, fin at the other, a lot like a cephalochordate. And that makes sense because we talked about the fact that the vertebrates were evolved from the cephalochordates, so they, ancestors kind of resemble that. The jawed fishes came about shortly after that. The development of jaws, we'll talk about how that works here in this section actually when we start talking about the fishes, really enabled the vertebrates to become a much larger animal, because all of a sudden, with jaws, an animal can attack and consume other organisms larger than themselves, which allows them to become bigger as well. We started to see shortly after that the amphibians moving on to land. There was an age of the amphibians for about 100 million years or so, maybe 80 million years or so, where they were the dominant land creature. They were big, fairly impressive, sort of scary-looking amphibians walking around on land. And then, of course, we move into the more probably well-known stage, the age of the reptiles, which, they were around for a bit longer as the dominant group, maybe 150 to 200 million years. They were the dominant group, including some of the animals that we call dinosaurs. Around 65 million years ago, the end of the dinosaurs, the end of the Cretaceous period, marked by the collision of a rather large asteroid with planet Earth, which wiped out the majority of the dinosaurs, led into the age of the birds and age of the mammals, which we're currently in now. So birds and mammals took over after the large reptiles, and so far at least, they're the group that's still around and dominating on land even today. So these are the groups we're going to go through. We're going to take a look at, basically in this section, all the fishes. Very broadly speaking, of course, all the fishes. In the next section, we'll move into the amphibians and reptiles. And then in the fourth and fifth sections, we'll take a look at the birds and mammals, respectively. So that's kind of the approach we're taking with this course, basically following the taxonomy of the group. We talked before about how paraphyletic groups are those that have a common ancestor but don't necessarily include all of the descendants. And we talked about that in a previous section as well. Having reptiles and birds as two separate groups is basically a paraphyletic type situation, right? So you want to include those two into one monophyletic group to create a more accurate picture of how evolution's actually worked over time. Fishes, in a way, are kind of similar to that as well, in terms of the classic sort of paraphyletic grouping of those organisms. All right, so we're starting now with our first main group of vertebrates. The fishes we talked about before is referring to the fact that there are more than one species of fish, and if you're talking about more than one species of fish, you talk about fishes. Not really a single group name for this. The fishes are not really taxonomically a single subphylum or class or order or anything like that. If we go back a second, we're going to take a look at these classes. So Myxini, Cephalosporomorphi, Chondrichthyes, Actinopterygii, Sarcopterygii. Those are the class names of the fishes that we're going to look at. And of course, within each class, then, there are orders and families and genera and species. A lot of times people forget genera is the plural name for genus. We don't say genuses. It's genera for more than one genus. So within each one of these classes, say Chondrichthyes, for example, is the class name for the sharks and skates and rays. There would then be orders and families and genera and species of sharks within that class. And it works the same for the others as well as for Mammalia and various other groups of animals here. So the fishes make up by far the biggest group of the groups of vertebrates. There's about 30,000 species of fishes. Of course, they're marine and freshwater primarily. Most fishes have vertebral column and paired appendages. There are a couple exceptions to that, but even those have a bit of a vertebral column and they don't have paired appendages. We'll talk about who those are here shortly. We have jaws, we have gills. How those are set up are going to differ depending on the group we're talking about, but all fishes, except for a couple exceptions, have jaws, and all fishes have gills. Now, when we talk about sort of the advancement of the vertebrates as a group, one of the very first things we see as a really important transition is a change from a single loop circulatory system to a double loop circulatory system. So let me explain what that is for a second here. A single loop circulatory system has essentially one pathway of blood throughout the entire body. So you sort of like map this out. If blood leaves the heart, it's going to go out from the heart in various large arteries. It's going to go to the gills, and then from the gills, it's going to go to the rest of the body. So in the gills, the blood picks up oxygen and drops off CO2, and from there, the blood goes out to the rest of the body to drop off oxygen and pick up CO2. And eventually, the blood gets back to the heart from there. So a single loop, heart to lungs to body to heart. Now, if we look at something more advanced than a fish in terms of circulatory system, so this goes for amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. When blood is circulating throughout the body, it's circulating in two separate loops. And so we talk about pulmonary circulation, which is circulation between the heart and the lungs, or the heart and the skin if you're dealing with an amphibian, and a separate loop which goes between the heart and the rest of the body. So we have a heart to lungs pulmonary loop, and then we have a heart to rest of the body, what we call a systemic loop for blood circulating in the body. And so the big benefit of that is that because the blood is being essentially repressurized after it comes back to the lungs, or back to the heart from the lungs, blood is pressurized after it comes back to the heart from the lungs. It's then repressurized before it goes back out to the rest of the body. So the blood going out to the rest of the body is going to be under higher pressure than it was back in the fishes. In the fishes, the blood had to go through the gills, give up a ton of pressure, and then what little pressure was left had to be sufficient to drive that blood throughout the entire rest of the body, right? So that's, it works, but it's not the most efficient means of circulation. If you're dealing with amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, blood is repressurized every time it goes into a new loop, which means the blood can get to the rest of the body faster. Now, the fishes have a different type of four-chambered heart than what we're going to see in, say, mammals and crocodilians, for example. But that heart is, it works, obviously. but it's again not as efficient as what we see in a three-chambered heart or a true four-chambered heart like we see in the reptiles and mammals, including birds with reptiles, of course, as well. Now, the fact that the fishes are the ancestral group to all of the other groups of vertebrates is indicative not only in DNA sequences, but also in the fact that some of their sort of quirky little deficiencies that they have are shared by their descendants, including us, including mammals, humans included, as well as reptiles and amphibians and everybody else. So, for example, fishes, for whatever reason, we don't really know why this is, it's sort of like an accident of evolution here. The fishes are only able to synthesize 11 out of the 20 different amino acids they need to build their proteins. And the other 9 amino acids they have to get in their diet. We call those the essential amino acids. All of the other groups of vertebrates have that same deficiency, humans included. Humans, we can synthesize 11 amino acids, but the other 9 we have to get in our diet because we can't, our bodies don't know how to make those other amino acids. So it's sort of like an evolutionary holdover from our fish ancestors. Now, there are two groups of very primitive, jawless fishes. And so there's a name for jawless fishes. It's not really a taxonomic name, it's more of a group name. We call them the agnathans. So it's Agnathan, agnathan, which literally means without jaws, is really what that translates to. And these two groups are the lamprey and the hagfish, right? Now, these two groups, lamprey, have the class name of Cephalosporomorphae, and the hagfish have a class name of Myxini. And those names are back on that the family tree, the taxonomic tree I showed you guys a few slides ago. So Cephalosporomorphae for the lamprey, Myxini for the hagfish, are our two groups of jawless fishes. Now, these groups are the groups that eventually gave rise to the more advanced fishes, and then from the more advanced fishes into the various other vertebrates as well, from amphibians to reptiles to mammals. And again, when I say reptiles now, I'm including birds with that because that's a more correct taxonomic feature to do it that way. As far as commercial significance, let's talk about the Myxini first. The hagfish, first off, with a name like hagfish, you don't really expect them to be the most like charismatic or pretty or cute species, and they're really, I guess, not to most people. This picture on this slide is a hagfish. They are jawless, of course. They are very slimy. They don't have much in the way of eyes. They don't have really much in the way of fins except for their tail fin. But they're completely harmless, right? So hagfish spend their life typically hanging out at the bottom of the ocean, and they essentially are marine detritivores. So if you imagine like a large shark or whale carcass, doesn't have to be that big, but just for kind of dramatic effect here, a dead whale that makes its way to the bottom of the ocean is going to be sort of inhabited by hagfish, which are then going to feed on that dead animal. And so that's how they make their living, right? They're doing a great ecosystem service by breaking down those dead animals and releasing those nutrients back into the marine environment. One thing about hagfish which is unique and kind of interesting, I think, is their way to escape predation. This is kind of something which is unique, and they're sort of famous for doing this. If something attacks a hagfish, their go-to defense is to secrete what essentially amounts to a mucus cocoon around themselves, which is going to protect them from predation, right? So if you imagine shark coming along and attacking a hagfish, and all of a sudden it's covered up in this thick, gooey, slimy, sticky layer of slime, maybe you're going to look elsewhere for a meal, right? It's probably not the most appetizing thing that you're going to encounter, so once the hagfish does that, then you just sort of leave it alone, once it makes that layer of mucus over itself. Now, when the predation threat is over, of course the hagfish can't continue to feed and function when it's covered up in this slime. It has kind of a unique way of ridding itself of that slime, and that is it's going to tie its body into a knot, okay? So when it does that, it ties its body into a knot and then slides that knot down the length of the body, and that actually releases the mucus from the body, and the animal can then swim away. So it essentially leaves a layer of mucus behind after the threat of predation is over, which is kind of a cool way for it to escape predation. Now, as far as commercial significance of the hagfish, there really isn't a whole lot. There are some applications where the skin of the hagfish is used for certain things, basically like a leather type substance. I've actually had people in class when I cover this section, and they all of a sudden sort of light up and they take out like a wallet and they say, yeah, I've got a hagfish skin wallet. which is kind of random, but it actually makes a fairly decent leather. It's a fairly high end, I guess, sort of leather, because you can't raise hagfish for skin like you can raise cows for their skin. So it's not the cheapest material, but it's actually a fairly nice, smooth, soft type leather. Now the other group of jawless fishes, or agnathans, is the cephalospidomorphi. The cephalospidomorphi are the lamprey, which we're going to look at some pictures here shortly and kind of talk about their role in the environment here in a second. The lamprey are much more important economically, and really not in a good way, because lamprey are ectoparasites on larger, more economically valuable fishes. And so they attach themselves to the body of a host. They will, I'll show you some pictures here in a second that shows their mouth, but they essentially will sort of rasp a hole in the side of another fish and then feed on the juice that comes out. Sort of making that a little overly dramatic, but that's kind of what it amounts to. And so a lot of fish populations, even in the Great Lakes, have been negatively impacted by the sea lamprey, which is an invasive species in the Great Lakes, which has had a huge impact on things like lake trout. Now, that being said, the lamprey are sort of like a scapegoat, right? We know they're not native. We know they definitely do have a bit of a negative impact on native fishes in the Great Lakes, but the declines of fisheries in the Great Lakes, fish populations in the Great Lakes, is much more heavily attributed to human fishing pressure than it is to lamprey feeding on these larger fishes. So they're sort of blamed for the crash of some fisheries in the Great Lakes, even though it's humans who have been the culprit there in most cases. We're not going to talk too much about the ostracoderms or a few of the other extinct groups. We are going to talk about how jaws came about. We'll see that here shortly, so we'll talk about that too. So this picture shows us some sea lamprey. We've got that very dramatic picture of the mouth here. These teeth, which are essentially modified scales that are used to, in conjunction with the tongue, which is like a blade here. Once the fish attaches to the other fish here, so the lamprey attaches to a lake trout, and it cuts a hole in the side of the body and feeds on bodily fluids, right? So this lake trout, which looks sort of horrified in this picture, I think, has 2 lamprey on it and a scar from a previous lamprey attack there, right? So these, it's not good for the lake trout. It's not happy about having these lamprey on it, but it's also not the worst thing that could ever happen to it. It's not as bad as being dragged in a net and cut up into pieces and eaten by humans. The lamprey are not having anywhere near that big of an impact on the fish as what human fishing pressure has on the lake trout populations. Sometimes when I'm putting these lectures together, I just find random pictures that makes me just ask the question, why? I don't know. I'm guessing this guy lost a bet. I'm not sure what's going on there, but, whatever. Okay, so the jaws. We talked about the jawless fishes being the ancestors to all the other groups of vertebrates, jawed fishes included. And so what we think happened here, and what people are fairly certain happened here, are fairly confident at least happened here, is that fishes like the jawless fishes that we just covered have gill slits. So if we go back and look at this lamprey, it's got gill slits. And these gill slits are supported in between by what are called gill bars or gill arches. And so these gill arches are made out of cartilage or bone, initially cartilage, and eventually the more advanced fishes have bone. This anterior-most pair of gill arches, we think, was very, very gradually over a long, long period of time as a result of mutations. This was not like an intentional process. This fish was not trying to do this. This took a long, long time, most likely due to a series of mutations. This anterior gill arch was rotated forward and down by about 90 degrees or so, and that's going to cause it to take on this shape. So now we have this gill arch, which has been rotated like 90 degrees, more or less, clockwise for the top and counterclockwise to the bottom. So it's kind of closed up in the front to form this type of structure here. Now this fish can actually open and close its mouth. And as we go along to more advanced fishes like this shark, now they can really open and close their mouth. And like I said before, once you have a fish that can open and close its mouth, now it can attack larger prey. It can, tear into them and eventually kill them and then bite off pieces. That was really the beginning of the race forward when it comes to the complexity of the fishes as a group. So we're not going to go through this stuff here. We're going to skip this slide. Okay, so not responsible for anything on that slide. Same thing with this slide here. And we're going to move actually now into the other two big classes of fishes. So we've talked about the Myxini up here. We've talked about, this is the hagfish. We've talked about the Cephalosporomorphi, which are the lamprey. Now we're into the Chondrichthyes. All right, Chondrichthyes, the name Chondrichthyes means cartilage fish. Later on, when we talk about cartilage as a tissue, we are going to talk about a type of cell called a chondrocyte. And we're going to talk about a protein called chondroitin. So chondro is cartilage. The chondrichthyes are the sharks and skates and rays, all the fishes that have completely cartilaginous skeletons. And they were the dominant sea predators for about 100 and about 80 million years or so. Look up to the Carboniferous period. In the meantime, on land, that was when the amphibians were kind of taking off as a group there as well. The skeleton is not completely cartilage, right? So there is a little bit of bony intrusion into the cartilage, calcium carbonate, which is different from the bone that we have in our skeleton. We use calcium phosphate, they use calcium carbonate, but they do have some ossification of the cartilage to give it additional strength. Their skeleton's very light, it's very strong, it's very flexible. Cartilage is more flexible than bone. But the downside to it is that cartilage is not especially repairable because the chondrocytes that make up the cartilage don't really divide that well, if at all, because they don't have access to a lot of blood flow. So one of the drawbacks of having cartilaginous skeleton is lack of repairability. In the water, you don't really think of fishes as having broken bones so much, so having a fairly static skeleton that doesn't repair is maybe not the biggest problem in the world, but on land, that would be a much more significant drawback. So on land, we see species that have bony skeletons. Bone, of course, is also very strong, a little bit flexible, but it's repairable, whereas cartilage is not so much repairable. The other big drawback of cartilage is that it is more dense than water. And so if you have a fish with a skeleton that's more dense than water, think about what the danger is there, the fish is going to sink. And so both cartilaginous and bony fishes have found solutions to the fact that their skeletons are more dense than water. The solutions are very different, but in the end, they accomplish the same task. In the cartilaginous fishes, the way they overcome their negative buoyancy is really two things, right? So number one, they're going to have a liver which is very, very large and very much filled with oil. And that oil is less dense than water. That helps them offset their negative buoyancy and therefore helps them to not sink in the water, just like a stone to the bottom of the ocean, right? So they're going to kind of like offset their negative buoyancy of the skeleton with positive buoyancy of this oil. And if you ever take a class where you dissect a shark, even a little one, one of the most memorable things about it is the fact that it's absolutely oily, very greasy on the inside, because they have that to help offset that negative buoyancy. The other thing they have, which is a little bit harder to explain, especially in an online type format, usually I draw this on the board, which I can't do right now, is the shape of their fins and the shape of their tail. If you look at the tail of a shark, Google shark or shark tail and look at the shape of its tail, the caudal fin. You're going to notice that the upper lobe of the fin is bigger than the lower lobe of that tail fin. So sharks have what are called heterocersal tails. So that when they move their tail back and forth in the water, the fact that the upper lobe is bigger than the lower lobe means they're going to have like an upwards trajectory as they swim in the water. That's going to drive their whole body upwards as well as forwards, which helps them offset the negative buoyancy. Their pectoral fins, which in this guy right here, this pectoral fin, if you were to look at these from the side, like a cross section of this fin, what you'd notice is the front edge of the fin is relatively thick and the trailing edge of the fin is relatively thin. So it's not completely the same all the way around. It's built very much like an airplane wing. And so airplane wings, are relatively thick on the leading edge and relatively thin on the trailing edge. What that does is help them to generate lift, which is pretty important if you're an airplane, and pretty important if you're a shark as well. So as they push their bodies forward through the water with their tail, this shape of this fin helps to generate lift, which pulls the body up in the water column as they're moving forward. Right? So it's a pretty ingenious solution to this negative buoyancy between the oil in the liver and the shape of their fins, both caudal and pectoral fins. And again, caudal fin is this tail fin. That helps them to move their bodies up in the water column when otherwise they would tend to sink in the water column. All right, so the chondrichthyes, in addition to being a jawed fish, also became a very, very fast fish. So now we have these all of a sudden very, very quick jawed, very toothy, and that's something we haven't seen before, right? In all the other groups of animals we've covered, we've not yet seen a tooth. This is the first group that we're going to see that actually has teeth. This makes them very, very good predators. If you imagine back, 360 million years ago, if all of a sudden there was something like this in the ocean, when previously there was nothing even remotely this big, this fast, or this sharply toothed, this thing is like a nightmare in the ocean. So that's going to cause a pressure on the prey to become, to have ways to escape predation, to either be able to come faster, to hide better, to fight back in some way, maybe have a shell or a spine or a toxin of some kind. We see a lot of what's called coevolution between predator and prey, and this really started back when the chondrichthyes were the dominant group in the ocean. So it's almost like an arms race, right? So think about two countries that have some kind of a weapon. The most famous and scariest example of that is nuclear weapons, back going into all the way up to the late 80s, into the 90s, and somewhat still even today, but not near as much as what there was previously. If one country develops a superior weapon, that then pushes the other country, the enemy of the first country, the enemy of the first country, to come up with an even better weapon, which then causes the first country to come up with an even better weapon. And this kind of goes back and forth until you get some really, really scary weapons in the case of the countries, or in the case of predator and prey, some really advanced adaptations to either catch prey or escape predation if you're the prey. So we see a lot of very rapid coevolution here. Something else about the sharks, and before I forget, this is a really good illustration of that heterocersal tail, large top lobe, small top lobe. So when this thing is going back and forth in the water, it's going to generate this kind of upward trajectory here, which helps to raise it up in the water column. So that's the tail thing I was talking about before. They also have what are called fusiform bodies. Fusiform is like a torpedo or a bullet shape. And so this shark, this tiger shark, is pointed at the front end, very narrow here. It's pointed at the back end, don't count the tail, but it's pointed here, and it's very wide in the middle. So this shape of pointed, wide, pointed is the absolutely most efficient way to build a body for moving through the water. It's the shape that's going to give the animal the least amount of drag. It's going to give it the greatest what's called laminar flow of water over the body, so a smooth flow of water, so it's not like turbulence, the opposite of turbulence. It lets them move through the water with the least amount of energy expenditure possible. Having that fusiform body helps them move efficiently through the water. We talked about the fact that they have teeth. In the case of the sharks and skates and rays, their teeth are actually modified scales. And so if you ever take a class on ichthyology, which is the study of fishes, you spend a lot of time looking at the different types of scales that are out there in the world of the fish. One type of scale is called a placoderm scale, and that is what sharks and skates and rays have. Those placoderm scales are what eventually became teeth. And so the advantage of that is that the teeth are always new and they're always sharp because they're always being replaced. If you look inside the mouth of a shark, or maybe more, I guess, if you want to be safe about it, look at a picture of the inside of the mouth of a shark. There are rows and rows and rows and rows of teeth that are constantly moving forward and replacing the teeth that are breaking off. So I guess kind of the drawback to having teeth like this is that the teeth are epidermal in origin. They're not bone. Like our teeth have bone that are set into other bones. It's actually a type of joint, the way our teeth fit into our jaws. Their teeth aren't like that. Their teeth are literally skin projections that happen to be large and sharp, but they're not very solid. And they tend to break off and they tend to come loose. Whenever a shark bites a prey or attacks a prey, it's going to lose a bunch of teeth every time. And so it has more and more and more rows of teeth to replace the ones that were lost previously. So that's an advantage. These predators always have nice, new, sharp, pointy teeth in the front of their mouth. The other thing that I want to talk about for just a second with the sharks and skates and rays is their reproduction. And so just about every animal we've looked at so far in this class has been the type of animal that reproduces through an oviparous strategy. So oviparous is Oviparous. Oviparous. Oviparous means the animal lays eggs and never sees them again after that. That's right. So eggs are deposited, the adult goes away to do other things. Eventually the eggs hatch, and when they hatch, the young or the juveniles, the offspring, are on their own to hopefully survive. All right, that is an oviparous strategy. Now, the sharks and skates and rays typically don't do that. And we're going to talk about a couple other options here as well in a second that they're going to pursue that's going to give them a bit more in the way of advanced reproduction. So when we talk about rays, these are things like spotted eagle rays. These guys are massive. Big spotted eagle ray, this could be 4 or 5 feet from fin tip to fin tip. These are big animals, long spine in the back. This is actually the tail. You can't see the spines. They're actually up here by the base of the tail. But absolutely just beautiful animals to watch in the water. I actually took these two pictures. This is one I found on the internet. But these two pictures I took in one of our marine biology classes. These things just glide through the water literally like they're flying. And they're just mesmerizing to watch as they move through the water. This is a southern stingray. These guys spend more of their time sort of hanging out on the bottom, sometimes burrowed in the sand. And they feed on various mollusks and things that are buried there and eat them that way. So this guy, again, you've got the tail here. This is a tail fin and a couple little spines up here. Stingrays are sort of famous for having those venomous spines, but they're really docile animals. And the only time they're ever going to sting or stab you is if you happen to step on one or harass one by trying to grab it, something like that. Otherwise, they're going to leave you alone. And these things actually are pretty... I guess patient maybe is a good way to say it, because I probably should admit this, but in certain parts of the marine biology class, there are some locations where the stingrays are fairly tame because they've been fed a lot. And so if you get in the water there, they will actually sort of swim over your body. And, you know, if they think you have food, they'll swim over the top of your head and over your arms. You can sort of put your hands out and feel them. And they're not going to sting unless you actually grab them and they feel threatened by you. It's a really creepy feeling at first, but it's actually kind of a cool thing once you get used to it. Now, the skin, speaking of those placoderm scales, the placoderm scales give the body a very rough, kind of abrasive appearance or feeling. It's almost like you're running your hand over a very, very fine grit sandpaper because of the shape of those scales on their body, which is kind of a unique thing to this group as well. Going back to reproduction for a second, right? We talked about the oviparous strategy of reproduction, but there are two other types. There is viviparous reproduction. Viviparous is Viviparous, going from memory here. Viviparous, which is giving birth to live young, and more specifically, giving birth to live young that had a connection to the female's body in some way. So mammals are viviparous for the most part. Almost all mammals are viviparous in that there is a placental connection between the female's reproductive tract and the offspring inside her body. There are some sharks that are viviparous. There are also some sharks that are ovoviviparous, which is another strategy, which is it's kind of like a cross between the other two, right? So an ovoviviparous species is one where the eggs hatch actually internally inside the body, inside the uterus, which is somewhat different from oviparous in the fact that they're still being maintained and protected inside the female's body for a while. Sharks in particular are very competitive as offspring. So when the offspring hatch inside the female's uterus, whichever ones hatch first are going to then typically consume the ones that hatch later on. And that's going to give them some added nutrition, give them a boost in growth, so when they do emerge from the female's body, they're bigger, they're stronger, they're faster, there's fewer things that can eat them, and they've got a better chance of survival, which is really important because most sharks don't produce a lot of offspring. Like, look at this picture here. This female just gave birth to this shark pup. Look how big this thing is compared to her body. It's huge. So obviously she's not going to have 100 or 500 of those inside of her uterus. She's going to have one or two that will, be able to emerge and go off and fend for themselves. So sharks especially are very much a quality over quantity kind of approach to reproduction. Skates and rays tend to be more oviparous. They tend to be more quantity over quality. So they give rise to a greater production of eggs, but the eggs are not taken care of as much. So they have an individually less chance of survival than if they were sharks. So slow reproduction, which means that shark populations have been greatly reduced over the entire world. And that really goes for just about every species of shark that's out there for different reasons, right? Sharks are persecuted because people are afraid of them because of Jaws and various movies. People are afraid of them. Sharks are persecuted because people think that if they kill off the sharks, there'll be more other fish for people to eat, which is usually not the case, for reasons we don't need to get into right now. That's not usually going to work that way. Sharks are persecuted for food, whether it's for their meats or if it's due to the harvesting of their fins for shark fin soup, which is a delicacy in parts of the world. Awful, awful practice. Incredibly damaging on shark populations. Basically, the sharks are captured, their dorsal fin is cut off, and the rest of the animal is left to die. It's almost like harvesting ivory from elephants or rhinos. It literally does the same thing to the animal in that it kills it, and it's a very little amount of food for what it wastes in the process. It's a really terrible kind of a thing to have. So when these populations are persecuted because they have these sort of relatively low reproductive rates, they're not able to recover all that quickly. So the populations don't rebound very quickly. Even if they're protected, it takes these populations a long time to bounce back because each female is only giving birth to maybe one or two offspring. Versus another species where maybe a female lays 1,000 eggs, and if populations are low, maybe those eggs for the most part survive. The population can bounce back a lot faster if you're giving birth to that many offspring. So from there, we're going to go to the bony fishes. Bony fishes evolved at the same time as the cartilaginous fishes, around 400 million years ago, but it took them a little bit longer to become the dominant group that they are now. If we talk about those 30,000 species of fishes, probably 29,000 of them are going to be bony fishes, right? So it's a much, much bigger and more diverse group than the cartilaginous fishes. So the bony fishes have, oddly enough, a skeleton made out of bone, and bone, of course, is also going to be more dense than water, so they would also tend to sink in the water as would a shark. But the bony fishes have come up with a couple of other strategies to help them deal with that particular potential limitation. So a swim bladder is the way they have to overcome their negative buoyancy and allow them to become positively buoyant or float in the water without having to spend a lot of energy. So a swim bladder is actually very similar to what scuba divers use to help them maintain their position in the water as well. We'll look at how that works here in a second. The operculum is a gill cover. And so this barracuda has right here a bony flap of tissue which covers its gills to protect them, but more importantly, to allow it to breathe and respire without having to move through the water. Now, if you go back and look at a shark, sharks have those gill slits on the side of their body, like we see in the tiger shark here, but they don't have a cover over the gills, which means for this shark to bring water over its gills, it has to have its mouth open and it has to swim forward through the water. Right? So it's got to be moving most of the time if it's going to be breathing. If we're dealing with a bony fish that has that operculum, they can actually open and close the operculum, which allows water to be sucked in through the mouth and then forced over the gills and out of the body. And when it goes over the gills, of course, that's when oxygen is extracted. That's when CO2 is added to the water that's being pushed out of the body, etc. So they can actually breathe in and force water out without moving forward just by opening and closing that operculum on the side of their head. Now the swim bladder, really kind of a cool structure. The swim bladder is internal. It is essentially a pouch or a sac that is attached to the animal's circulatory system. And so gases in the blood can be pumped into this sort of muscular swim bladder sac sort of a structure and make it inflate. And when it inflates, that causes the animal to rise in the water column. Right? So it's just like what scuba divers call a buoyancy compensating device, or BCD. If you scuba dive, you have a vest on, well, usually a vest, which is attached to your scuba tank, and you can actually inflate that vest using air from your tank. When you do that, that causes you to start to ascend in the water, go up in the water column. If you expel the gas from your BCD, your weights that you wear will then cause you to sink in the water column. So rather than having to swim upwards, like imagine being down under 100 feet of water and having to swim to the surface. That would be incredibly tiring to do that. Instead, what you do is you gradually inflate your BCD with air from your tank, and that causes you to slowly ascend in the water column. And of course, you also have to make your stops and do that kind of thing to make sure that you don't have other issues with the bends and so forth, gas bubbles in your blood. So you got to do it the right way, but you don't have to spend much energy doing it. Swim bladder works the same way, right? They fill it full of air, that makes them float. They expel the air, that makes them sink. And so they can actually adjust their up and down position in the water just by using this swim bladder. The operculum, like we said, is this flap right here, which they can then open to pull water in and close to force water out as they respire. So that's also, in addition to being protective, it's a way for them to breathe without having to constantly swim forward all the time. So this is a swim bladder inside the body. Looks like a squirrelfish. That's actually a thing. The swim bladder is right here. Circulatory vessels here. Gases can be pumped into this. It inflates and the animal rises. And if gases are pumped out, it deflates and the animal goes down in the water column. So a really kind of clever way to, again, adjust their position in the water without spending a lot of energy. All right, we're not going to do too much taxonomy of the bony fishes because it's too big of a group to do that. But there are essentially two main groups of bony fishes. And bony fishes, like we talked about, remember how I said before the jawless fishes are called the agnatha? The bony fishes are also called the osteichthyes. Osteichthyes means bony fish. So there are two groups of osteichthyes or bony fishes. The first one is the really by far the biggest one, called the actinopterygii. These are the ray-finned fishes, okay? The ray-finned fishes are the fishes that most of us are most familiar with. So bass and perch and walleye and those kinds of things, those are all ray-finned fishes. Those are all actinopterygians. The thing that makes them different from the other group is that their fins have bony rays in them, but they don't really have bones in them per se. And they also don't have muscles in their fins. The muscles that move the fins in an actinopterygian are actually in the body, and then they move the fins kind of from a distance. The other group of fishes have actually muscles in their fins to cause those fins to move very close to where they actually have their effect. Actually, both groups of bony fishes have homocersal tails, where the upper and bottom lobes are the same size and same shape, as opposed to the heterocersal tail that we saw in the sharks. Bony fishes have homocersal tails. The lobe-finned fishes are the sarcopterygians, and this is a very, very small group. There's a couple species here of what are called coelacanth. There's a few other things called lungfish, but it's actually a very, very small number of species, especially for a whole class of an organism. There really aren't that many species of sarcopterygians. Their fins are going to have bone in them. They have little bones in their fins, just like we have bones in our arms, as opposed to the actinopterygians, which had rays in their fins, but not anything like a bone like we think of. Sarcopterygians also have those muscles that are in the fins themselves, so much more similar to our arms and legs, our appendages, than are the ray-finned fishes. That's significant, as you might predict, because the sarcopterygians are the group that gave rise to the rest of the vertebrates. So even though the sarcopterygians are not a very big group, they're the ones that include the ancestors that eventually became amphibians, and amphibians eventually transitioned, of course, into reptiles and mammals. So this is the ancestral group to the other vertebrates on land, as opposed to the actinopterygii. The sarcopterygii are the ancestral group. So it's kind of a quick look here at the different structures in the fins of actinopterygian fish versus sarcopterygian fish. This is a coelacanth on the right. Coelacanths are kind of a cool organism. They were one that were thought to be extinct for a long, long time. People had seen fossils of them, but never caught one in real life or never saw one in real life, so they were assumed to be extinct. And turns out that wasn't the case. There's kind of a cool story that goes along with how they were discovered, and that's what this DinoFish website picks up. If you're at all interested, go look at it. It's a really cool little story. Obviously not responsible for this class, but it is kind of a fun little story about how they were discovered and how we learn more about them. So they are another one of those living fossil type species. This is the biggest of the lobe-finned fish. And again, this is the group that would have given rise to the amphibians. So from there, we're going to wrap this section up. And when we start our third section, we are going to do the amphibians and reptiles. And then from there, eventually we'll move into the birds and mammals. Next.